Let's talk about an absolutely fascinating new book written by, I have to say, absolutely fascinating, and I would say incredibly brave and courageous author, Andy Ngo, who joins us now to talk about his brand new book, Unmasked, Inside Antifa's Radical Plan to Destroy Democracy. Good morning to you, Andy.
Good morning. Thank you
Morning.
for having me
No,
on.
thank you so much for coming on. You're an American journalist, and I got to know you, as I think many of my followers might on Twitter might have got to know you after you were covering protests back in Portland, Oregon. You covered the Antifa protests back in 2019, a Black Lives Matter protest in 2020, and you don't really so much as just report on protests. You often get right into the thick of it, and you yourself have been targeted and indeed have suffered some quite severe injuries while getting sort of down and dirty into the middle of it. Tell us what happened to you.
In 2019, in the summer, I was covering one of these routine Antifa protests turned riots in my home city of Portland, and I have been covering them for a few years now and writing critically about their acts of violent extremism. And for that, in an organized plan, they targeted me in a beating, and I had to go to the hospital, and I was diagnosed with a brain hemorrhage.
Yeah, I mean, it was a very serious injury. I mean, I saw the video footage of a lot of this. It's absolutely extraordinary. Now, I suppose first of all, a question I really want to know in terms of why you do this is sort of what motivates you, because often in these in the coverage of such events there's a lot of he said she said arguments that the mainstream media isn't covering it enough, arguments that people always have an agenda when it comes to covering these sort of riots, and that you come with a political agenda. But what do you say about your motivations for covering these protests?
My parents were settled in the United States as political refugees after escaping communist Vietnam. They're both victims of the prison camps there in the 70s. And so for me, I don't take the freedoms and liberties that have been granted to me by birthright citizenship for granted. So to see the systematic attack on not just institutions and civil societies in my home country, but actually literal attacks on the ideals, founding ideals. That's what motivates me. And the issue that I saw primarily was that in Portland, Oregon, the Pacific Northwest of the United States, which is the epicenter of American Antifa, the political violence that was happening there was being framed by biased local journalists as simply anti-fascist, anti-racist, opposing the far right.
Yeah.
Well, what I was seeing was that there was indiscriminate, wanton violence against citizens and property.
And that's it. I think a lot of people listening will go, well, Antifa. Well, a lot of people go, what is Antifa? As you described, it's an anti-fascist movement. And they sound like the good guys. I mean, who isn't anti-fascist, people would say. Therefore, they are the good guys. The same sort of territory when you talk about BLM, Black Lives Matter. Well, who doesn't think Black Lives don't matter? But your experience of Antifa is very, very different. Tell us what you have discovered, what you have found with your investigations and your following of those protests on the ground.
Antifa, they call themselves anti-fascists, but they're anarchist communists. So they don't recognize the legitimacy of any nation state, and the principal enemy they view is the United States, and also to an extension, her allies such as Britain and other Western liberal democracies. So they view the United States as this imperialistic state that upholds white supremacy and fascism through systems of oppression such as capitalism, the protection of property rights, etc. And they attack law enforcement because they don't view the American criminal justice system as legitimate. And so but it's not, it goes beyond that into acts of actual domestic terrorism. My city, throughout 2020, for more than 120 days, we had nightly occurring riots that happened day after day after day against city and federal property. Mm-hmm. So I know the world recoiled in horror when they watched what happened on 6th of January in the Capitol.
Yeah.
That happened, and worse, every day for months on end in my city, and there was no condemnation.
And this was the bizarre thing. I mean, bizarre doesn't even do justice to it. I mean, I think we were all horrified by what happened with the storming of the Capitol by those Trump supporters, and of course that's leading to these impeachment trial in the Senate that's going to be coming in February. But there does seem to be one rule for one and one rule for the other. Now, the argument on the day of the Washington D.C. saw those protests and that storming of the Capitol, the argument being that if they had been, say, Black Lives Matter protesters, they would have been treated very differently by law enforcement because if they'd been black, not white. And yet we have actually seen very different law enforcement, very different media coverage when we see particularly Antifa, but also Black Lives Matter protests, almost sort of saying, well, these people feel passionately, it's somehow it's justifiable, it's understandable. But I imagine when it's your business or your home that's been burnt down, or you're living in fear every night, that the people, coming into your neighbourhood to do that it doesn't really matter what the cause is. There's still the same level of fear.
Yeah, the argument is that if the protesters or rioters had been left wing or far left and they would have been treated much harsher, that's absolutely not true. You can look, for example, how they were treated, let's say, in Seattle, the largest city in the Pacific Northwest, when BLM and Antifa actually claimed territory as a separate sovereign city-state, Chaz, for more than 3 weeks. The federal response from that and the state response was essentially to let them go and do it. And this area, the no-go zone, which they set up a hard border that was manned by armed militias, devolved into chaos and multiple homicides and shootings.
It's absolutely extraordinary. And I think a lot of people will be saying, that's funny, I didn't really read much about this in the media. I didn't really hear much about it. Why do you think the mainstream media hasn't covered this so much?
It's as you said a moment ago, it's simply, in a sense, so stupid, but these movements, Antifa or BLM, call themselves anti-fascist or anti-racist, they claim to be fighting for racial justice. So if you are criticizing actually their ideology and their actions, then simply it's turned around on you that, oh, that must mean you're pro-fascism or you're not in support of racial justice.
Yeah.
It's just a simple trick that's fooled everybody. But for me, I don't care what they call themselves. I look at what they preach, their literature, and their actions, and all of it points to a violent extremist ideology movement.
Yeah, it's quite bizarre. Do you think things will change now there is a Democratic government in the White House, in a president? They've got full charge of Congress and the White House. Do you think things will change now? There'll be something of a face-off. Do you think things will get better or worse?
I think things will get worse because for the past 5 years, the mainstream left and the Democrats in the US have been feeding and growing this beast by excusing its acts of extremism. And now I think it's too big to slay. So since November, since Biden had won the election, there's been numerous riots in the Pacific Northwest. They've been extremely violent. There were just violence on Inauguration Day in Seattle, in Portland, and the Antifa rioters destroyed the headquarters of the Democrat Party office in Portland. So these are extremists who don't recognize any governing power in the US. They want to destroy it all. And that's what, I hope readers from the left who read my book will recognize the threat to American democracy by the Antifa.
I mean, you look like sort of a very ordinary young man, but you're very, very extraordinary. And I think your bravery in covering these protests has been quite extraordinary.